Welcome to Thursday's edition of COVID-19. I'm Min San-hee. Concerns over cluster infections continue here in Korea, and as part of the most recent efforts to stem these cases, authorities have mandated QR code registration at places of worship and banned small-scale religious activities. Now, we have more on that later on the program, but first, here are the latest numbers on the pandemic with our Kwon So-ah and related news with our Yoon Jung-min. So I hear that there's been a slight drop in confirmed cases here in Korea today. Do start us off with those numbers.
Sure, there has been a slight drop, but also an increase in the southwestern city of Gwangju, which is a big concern there. But also there has been a decline in the numbers in the metropolitan region. So before we get into the details by region, let's take a look at the general updates. We have 50 new confirmed cases, and that brings the total to 13,293. And the death toll stands at 287, as we have 2 additional reports of fatalities. And 987 people remain in quarantine, not much different from yesterday. And 12,019 people have made a full recovery from the COVID-19 virus. Now, if we take a look at our graph now, we have a dozen less cases compared to yesterday. I just want to mention that yesterday's number has been revised to 62 from 63 by the government later in the day yesterday. And it looks like the average has been around the 50s for the past week. And now if we move over to our map, as I said before, there's a concern here in Gwangju because there's been 15 new cases, and that's not only more than 8 in Gyeonggi-do province or 8 in Seoul, but here in the metropolitan region there were only 7 local transmissions. So the rest of those were imported cases, and that means that's actually good news in this region, as it's been the first time in 17 days that local infections in the metropolitan area were below 10. Meanwhile, Daejeon also has 6 new cases, and these cases in 6 in Daejeon and 15 in Gwangju were all not imported but local infections. And with that, let's move over to our global updates. So we have a total of 12.1 million cases, as more than 215,000 have been added in the span of a day. So recently we've been seeing 200,000 new cases on a daily basis, and also more than 5,000 people have died, bringing the total to 552,046. And meanwhile, we have 7 million recoveries. And let's move over to the major outbreaks around the world. We have 3.15 million cases in the U.S. as more than 60,000 new cases have been added, especially a concern in the states of California and Texas that have 10,000 new cases. And meanwhile, Russia has surpassed the 700,000 mark, and with a death toll over 10,000. Let's move over to other places. We have Spain here almost at 300,000 cases, and a big concern in Mexico, as that has more than 6,900 cases added in the past 24 hours, bringing the total to 275,003. And those are the figures I have for now, but I'll be back with more updates after the government briefing. Back to Sunny.
Right, so thank you for that. I'll see you back at the desk. Right, COVID-19 is affecting industries here and elsewhere around the world. The outbreak is hurting many sectors, including airlines and automobile. But at the same time, it's been boosting business for semiconductors and biohealth products. For more on this, I have Yoon Jung-min here in the studio. Welcome, Jung-min.
Hello, Sunny.
Right, Jung-min, let's start off with industries that have been negatively affected by the pandemic.
Well, sure. I first want to talk about airline business because they are one of the hardest hit industries due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, South Korea's major airlines posted losses during the first quarter. That's because, well, countries closed borders and people refrained from traveling overseas due to the pandemic. So Korean Air, the country's flagship carrier, posted an operating loss of almost $47 million from January to March. Its sales were down over 22% on year. Asiana Airlines, Korea's second largest air carrier, posted an operating loss of over $173 million during the same period. A number of low-cost carriers were also in the red during the first quarter of this year, and this isn't just the case with Korean Airlines. Take a listen first.
We forecast a loss of revenues for airlines that is accounting for $419 billion, which is 50% of our revenues, and cumulative loss for the industry around $84 billion.
Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Emirates, the largest airline in the Middle East, is reportedly looking to cut 30,000 jobs. That's roughly a third of its workforce. Sources say Emirates is preparing for a prolonged slump in the tourism sector. 4 major airlines in the U.S. have asked over 100,000 employees to voluntarily go on short-term leave or to take early retirement.
Well, that is very unfortunate to hear. How is the airline industry here in Korea seeking to cope with these difficulties?
Right, so to tackle falling demand, South Korean airlines have started loading cargoes instead of passengers on their empty seats. So in its latest earnings report, Korean Air said that its freight revenue increased about 3% in the first quarter. Asiana Airlines have also begun carrying goods, including boxes of masks and other medical supplies. Aside from that, the airlines have also started resuming international flight services recently. Korean Air partially resumed its flights to several routes in North America since last month. And it plans to further expand passenger flight operations this month, but it would still amount to less than a third of the 110 international routes it operated before the pandemic. The government, on its side, plans to give financial aid to help the airline business.
Well, that is good to know that the government is seeking to share the burden. I understand the automobile industry is also being negatively affected.
That's right, Sunny. So, well, unfortunately, the automobile industry has also been battering. In its latest report, Korea's trade ministry said the country's car exports tumbled over 33% on year in June. So car exports have been on a steady decline for the past couple of months. This is mainly because several auto plants in the U.S. and Europe had to shut down due to the coronavirus. On top of the supply issues, demand has been also weakening too. Europe and North America take up more than 2/3 of Korea's car exports and more than half of Korea's auto parts exports. Well, this is what an expert on industry analyst had to say.
A car requires an average of nearly 30,000 auto parts. It requires a massive supply chain. But manufacturers, including some in China, have been hit hard by the coronavirus. Also, the pandemic has added uncertainties on households, which have reduced consumption.
So despite the difficulties, global car makers have been launching new models and future cars, such as hydrogen vehicles. This comes as they attempt to find future growth engines amid unfavorable business conditions.
Now, on a cautiously brighter note, I hear there are some industries that have been doing well, though, despite the pandemic.
Well, sure. Like you said, there are some sectors, not all industries are suffering. There are some sectors that are doing well because of this coronavirus pandemic. For one, we can say there is health-related industries. In fact, biohealth exports jumped around 53% from the previous year in June. Those include drugs, COVID-19 test kits, and biosimilars. I talked to an official from a local biotech company earlier to learn more about this. Have a listen.
Our test kits are used in Seoul and other local hospitals. We have been exporting our products overseas to Russia, India, Myanmar, and other countries. Demand has also been high for sample kits and research documents.
And that's not all. Semiconductors and computers are also seeing more demand amid the outbreak. In May, semiconductor exports rose 7%, and it also edged up in June. Computer exports jumped over 91% last month. This is because there has been an increasing in demand for non-contact services due to the pandemic. Experts say South Korea's biotech and computer sectors are two of the most promising industries in this time of crisis, saying the country should nurture them into future growth engines.
Hopefully that will become a reality in the near future. All right, Chongmin, thank you for your coverage. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you for having me.
Right, we turn now to the regular government briefing on COVID-19 here in Korea. And while we wait for that to commence, here are a few facts about the contagion here in the country. Some 91% of Korea's... Oh, I have to interrupt myself because the briefing is about to start. I'll get back to you afterwards.
Let us now begin our regular briefing for July 9th, Thursday, on the COVID-19 response here in South Korea. First of all, we have 28 new local infections and 22 new imported cases today. And the total number of confirmed cases now stands at 13,293. And 49 new people have been discharged following full recovery, and a total of 987 people are in quarantine. We had 2 additional fatalities. I extend my deepest condolences to the members of the bereaved families, as well as the deceased. Here are some updates on domestic infections. In Gwangju, we had 15, and Daejeon, we had 6 cases, and also the rest happened at the Seoul metropolitan area. And here are some details on the updates of domestic infections. Related to Wangseong Church in Gwanak-gu District, Seoul City, we had 1 more church member in home quarantine being confirmed. In total, 39 cases have been confirmed. Related to a finance office at Gangnam-gu District, Seoul City, we have 1 additional case. A total of 8 people have been confirmed. Related to door-to-door sales group in the Seoul metropolitan area, we have 1 more additional case. And we also have classified people of 3 unidentified sources of infection have been diagnosed in relation to the Gumpo Happyrang Healing Center. And the total now stands at 34. And in relation to 더 좋은 hospital at Seogu Daejeon City, we have a total of 12 confirmed cases to date. And in Gwangju City, in relation to a door-to-door sales group, we have 10 additional cases, and the total case now amount to 105. And the newly confirmed cases were members of and were related to the Gwangju Central Church, as well as sauna facility there named SM, as well as an office space. And in Gwangju Donggu District, we have a private academy, and we have 12 confirmed cases for this academy with 6 more cases. And here are some updates on the imported cases: 8 from America, 1 from Africa, and 13 from Asia, excluding China. 6 were from Kazakhstan, 3 from Uzbekistan, and 2 were from the Philippines. And yesterday, on the 8th of July, we have had 157 ships that have embarked at ports nationwide, and we are continuously carrying out our onboard quarantine measures. And a total of 301 people have been expressing their intentions to donate their plasma samples for the treatment, and more than 150 people have actually donated their samples. So we thank them for your support once again. And here are some of the analysis on the antibodies of the COVID-19 found here in Korea. And this is a mid-level analysis result, and starting from the about 1,055 samples that have been collected starting from April to mid-June. We have selected the samples from Korean citizens, and also we have collected the samples about for 1,500 samples at the Seonam provinces in the Korean country, and we have collected these samples during the month of May, and the analysis shows that, as we said, about the 1,055 cases that have been collected nationwide, all of them had tested negative. So there were no single case of positive. And about the 1,500 samples that were collected in the Seonam area, we have 1 case that have been tested positive. So these are the analysis results that we have gained so far. And yesterday, the KCDC has held a meeting in relation to the experts, and we have had a meeting of these results, and they have said that in analyzing and interpreting the results, it is assumed that in areas like Daegu are not included, and there are a lack of the representativeness. Therefore, we cannot ascertain that all of these samples could represent the infection infection status of the nation as a whole. And also at global level, there are some comparisons that we could make. We could say that in Korea, the antibody rate could be lower than the level of other countries because all thanks to swift tracing and swift testing and active participation by the public in social distancing. So we believe that these are the updated opinions of the experts. And going forward, every 2 months, we will carry out our analysis for these samples. And these are done under the umbrella of the Public Nutrition Survey. And also, we will collect the samples for the people in Gyeongnam as well as Daegu. And we will collect about 3,000 samples. And we will also do such similar analysis for those who have no symptoms or mild symptoms. Last but not least, we have some messages with regards to the COVID-19 infections. We highlight this multiple times, but COVID-19 can spread at any closed, crowded, and close contact environment. Therefore, we ask the members of the public to refrain and to cancel, postpone your gatherings or meetings, and please comply with wearing face masks and other quarantine protocols. Last but not least, we have further messages for the public. As we mentioned so far in relation to the above survey, as for the antibody developed by the Korean citizens, we have had further talks with the experts, and we believe that there are, of course, limitations to these testings. However, these have been revealed to the public because there are high interest in the public to know about these results, and we will be carrying out regional surveys and investigation for Daegu and other regions, and we will also take a full picture of the outbreaks that are carried out here in the country. And as we mentioned, just by these samples do not speak of all of the infections that are taking place in the country, and of course they have limitations and restrictions. However, we believe that these could have two possible implications going forward. Of course, these have been discussed by the experts yesterday as well, but these are some the implications. First, in Korea, we believe that the immunity of the people of the Korea, the citizens, would be also very low, and these could be a result or an expectation that could be implemented from the conditions abroad as well. And this is an inevitable because we do not have a vaccine as of yet. And up until we have an effective vaccine and before we have these vaccines to immune and all of the citizens, it is very difficult for us to curb the virus fully, and the only effective method at hand is wearing face masks and live quarantine measures. And second implication is as follows. And in beginning of this year, after the major outbreak of Daegu and Gyeongbuk province, we have the size of the outbreak, and we also have a less possible difference between the actual number of infection and the people with immunity. So this has been made possible thanks to all of the citizens' support and participation for the quarantine measures, including social distancing, and also thanks to the efforts put forth by the medical staff to test swiftly the confirmed cases, and also centering around the quarantine officials. And we believe that they have made great accomplishments and dedications. We tell you this multiple times, but these testings were carried out with a small number of samples and did not include the regional analysis of Daegu and Gyeongbuk region. And also, there are limitations as to these survey and analysis, and there could also be a possibility of developing immunity and antibody, but these have eroded in the time. However, we want to highlight that this could be a great time for us to learn about these new implications. And we continue to hear about the possible second massive outbreak, or a possible massive outbreak in the winter time. However, we shall not be too nervous or too afraid of our future, and it is the aim of our life quarantine measures to not enable such grim future. And through these life quarantine measures, there is a possibility for us to overcome the further outbreak. And I believe these are also some of the implications that we could learn from the above survey. And each and every member of the public are very responsible and very important quarantine agents. Therefore, we ask you to continue to help and cooperate with our measures going forward. Thank you very much.
Right, so that was Kwon Junuk, the Vice Head of KCDC, with Thursday's afternoon briefing to give us a summary of the key announcements.
All right, well, there have been numerous new reports of cluster infections in the metropolitan region as well as in the southwestern city of Gwangju, which now has 105 cases linked to a door-to-door sales business with 10 additional cases there. So that remains a concern. And also the government appears to have made some research and assessment on the coronavirus immunity level here in Korea when it comes to Koreans. And it looks like antibody levels in Koreans appears to be lower than the average of other peoples across the world, and also that the immunity level seems to be lower. So that could be a concern, but that's also why we have to abide by the social distancing measures. And that's why Kwon also mentioned that herd immunity would be not the thing to fight the COVID-19 virus here in Korea. And he also mentioned that there have been concerns about a second wave of COVID-19 in winter time, but that we should not be too concerned about that, as the government is trying to tackle the measures with new, stronger measures, especially here a reminder, beginning Friday, 6 p.m. tomorrow, religious gatherings, excluding regular service, will be banned. That means little meetings like choir practices or lunch services or other Bible meetings, for instance. So that's something to remember, which is going to begin tomorrow.
All right, so thank you for that. We'll see you again tomorrow.
Thank you.
Right, in line with efforts to better contain COVID-19, the government here has mandated a high-tech registry at high-risk facilities. The QR code-based entry log system went on trial last month, and starting this July, it has been made mandatory at venues, including nightlife establishments, logistics centres, and large-scale crime schools. We have details on that initiative in this next report.
From July 1st onwards, all high-risk facilities in Korea most vulnerable to COVID-19 have been required to implement a QR code electronic register called KeyPass.
약 한 달간 시범 적용과 계도 기간을 거쳐 미비점을 보완해 왔습니다. 개인정보는 철저히 보호하면서도 확진자 발생 시에는 신속한 추적 관리가 가능해질 것으로 기대합니다.
12 types of facilities with high infection risks, including nightclubs and singing rooms, as well as private academies and buffet restaurants where cluster infections have recently occurred, are mandated to implement the KeyPass system. Business establishments that show negligence and visitors who falsify their personal information could face a maximum fine of 3 million Korean won, or approximately $2,500.
이태원 클럽에서 수기로 작성한 출입 명부에서 허위로 기재된 것이 있어서 방역에 좀 큰 어려움이 있었던 사례가 있었습니다. 또한 수기 출입 명부 같은 경우에는 종이나 펜을 통해서 감염 우려가 있고 정보 유출 가능성도 있습니다. 이런 점들을 보완하기 위해서 QR코드를 활용한 전자 출입 명부를 도입하게 되었습니다.
KeyPass is a system that operates on the basis of QR codes. QR codes are used in many different applications, thanks to the proliferation of smartphones.
QR코드에 빛을 쏘게 되면 검은색은 빛이 덜 반사되고 흰색은 빛이 많이 반사됩니다. 그럼 카메라가 그걸 인식하는 겁니다. 강하게 반사된 빛과 약하게 반사된 빛을 인식해서 강하게 반사된 빛은 1로 해석하는 거고요. 약하게 반사된 빛은 0으로 해석하는 겁니다. 그걸 컴퓨터는 이제 정보로 바꾸는 거죠.
The QR codes are scanned by the facility operators via a special application to create an electronic register. The data containing your name, phone number, the name of the establishment, and the time of your visit is divided and saved in 2 separate locations.
엄격히 말씀드리면 QR코드 자체에 개인정보가 포함되지는 않습니다. QR코드 자체에는 QR코드를 식별할 수 있는 식별 고유값만 포함되고요. 추후 이제 고위험 시설에 확진자가 나왔을 경우 방역당국의 요청에 의해 미리 로그인한 사용자의 이름과 또 그 사용자가 인증한 본인 인증 번호만을 그 방역당국에 제공하게 됩니다.
The collected data is deleted automatically after 4 weeks. However, some critics have voiced concerns of possible violations in privacy rights.
이 2개의 서버 기록이 합쳐지기 전까지는 개인을 추적하기 어렵기 때문에 프라이버시 걱정은 안 해도 된다라고 얘기하고 있는 거고요. 정부가 수집한 정보가 얼마나 투명하게 관리되고 있는지 객관적으로 투명하게 공개할 필요는 있을 것 같습니다.
KeyPass is just the latest in Korea's evolving approach to fight the spread of COVID-19 through innovation.
The COVID-19 pandemic pushed economies into a great lockdown that saved lives, but also triggered the worst recession since the Great Depression.
이번 하반기 경제정책 방향에서는 추경을 비롯한 정책 효과 그리고 정부의 강력한 정책 의지를 담아 플러스 0.1%의 성장 목표를 제시하고자 합니다.
Equally as grim as the outlook on COVID-19 is the outlook on the global economy in light of the former's prolonged presence. In today's studio session, we take a look at Korea's economic prospects for the second half of the year and government measures to keep the economy afloat. I have James Rooney from Seoul Financial Forum. Hello, Mr. Rooney.
Good afternoon.
And I also have Bruce Han from Q Investment Partners. Good to see you again, Mr. Han.
Thank you for having me back.
Right, Mr. Han, let's begin with the impact of the pandemic on the global economy thus far.
Well, it's rocked the global economy. I mean, a few sectors have benefited: pharmaceuticals, e-commerce platforms, telecommunication, and certain protective medical equipment sectors. But the other sectors have not. And the first time I was on here, I was very optimistic, as you know. But now I've become somewhat muted. I think the virus will continue for quite some time, and because of this, the IMF has taken this into consideration and last week revised downward some of their projections. Globally, minus 4.9. US, 8%. When I first was here, it was 5.8. Korea, not so bad, minus 2.1 from previous 1.2. Eurozone, minus 10%. Now, this virus has affected sectors that we never thought would be affected, like the airline sector, tourism. It's hard to imagine now, but 50% of planes globally are on the ground and in storage. And what's more worrisome is that bankruptcies continue to happen. For instance, like in the US, One of my favorite retailers, Brooks Brothers, which I have on now, just filed for bankruptcy yesterday. Last week, Cirque du Soleil. And what's most worrisome is that what started out as a health issue has now become a politicized issue, which I think will prolong the recovery process. And I think global equity markets are pricing a prolonged continuation of the crisis.
Right. Mr. Rooney, I take your attention to the Korean economy. How do challenges faced here in Korea in light of COVID-19 compare to those perhaps that were seen during the Asian financial crisis, do you think?
So people like to talk about some of these crises in the same vein. And during the last 20 years, whilst I've been living in Korea, we've now had 3 distinct major crises. The global financial crisis 10 years ago, which Korea sailed through actually fairly successfully. It wasn't our problem. And we had the IMF crisis, as I still like to call it, which is when Bruce and I met before, otherwise called the Asian financial crisis. But that was a crisis of our own making. And actually, the crisis was deepened by the actions of the IMF. We didn't have the same crisis happening in Europe, we didn't have it happening in the US, and we didn't have China sitting beside us at that time. China was still a largely closed market and much, much smaller than it is today. So in 1998, Korea actually was able to rescue itself, and I think that's very significant. Today, it's not that easy because everybody else is having a problem. However, I think the same spirit is important, the spirit of self-rescue, the spirit of we can get through this and we can rebuild, but we have to do it, as Bruce has just said, with a lot of challenges against us. Korea had just become an economy that is driven by tourism. We have wonderful visitors from overseas coming here and lots of things for them to see and do. So I think the important thing is not to look for the similarities, except in Korea's opportunity to take initiatives itself.
Oh, I see. Mr. Han, how is Korea's financial markets faring then?
Well, the Korean financial market is quite stable. As you know, in March, people absolutely panicked. Kospi plunged below 1,500. The Korean won went up to 1,300. But the stock market immediately went into a V-shaped recovery mode because of the South Korean government's aggressive stimulus packages, giving money to citizens, buying corporate bonds, buying corporate paper, and most importantly, with the currency swap with the US government, the currency stabilized. So the Korean financial market is quite stable. The Bank of Korea has provided ample liquidity. Interest rates remain low, and the Korean stock market is dominated by manufacturing companies which have demand not only here in Korea but also abroad. And also the retail sector, unlike other countries, did not go into complete lockdown. So people have been going out, people are spending money, they are making revenue, but obviously compared to pre-coronavirus, the numbers aren't as good.
Right. Meanwhile, last month, global financial institutions and credit rating agencies disclosed this year's figures for global growth. And to learn more about Korea's economic prospects for the year, I have Vincent Kuhn at the Economics Department of the OECD in Paris. Welcome, Dr. Kuhn.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
Dr. Kuhn, what is the OECD's projection for Korea's economy this year?
Well, we have indeed revised our projections for the world economy and for Korea dramatically this spring, the most dramatic revision ever. For the world, we're looking at -6% in the best case, with double-digit contractions in a number of economies, including France, where we are headquartered, but also Italy, Spain, the UK. For Korea, we project GDP to fall by only 1.2% in our optimistic scenario. Of course, by now, retail sales have bounced back in many countries, and as these countries lifted their lockdowns and shops reopened. For example, we've seen an 18% jump of retail sales in the euro area. But to some extent, this reflected pent-up purchases, and so it won't last. And household spending remains 5% below the level 1 year earlier. On the production side, we also see a rebound. After the largest fall, we have had the largest increase, so a sharp V. But again, we're not back to the levels 1 year ago. In Germany, for example, the biggest economy in the euro area, factory output is 20% lower still than 1 year ago.
Dr. Kun, you spoke about Korea's economy shrinking by 1.2%. How do you explain Korea's relatively favorable economic prospects, especially in light of the grim forecasts for most of its global partners?
Well, Korea's resilience has a lot to do with its prompt reaction earlier in the year when other OECD countries were still dithering. Korea really took drastic measures very quickly, and we've seen how 1 week of procrastination can make a big difference in how the sanitary crisis unfolds. Korea has been very proactive with extensive testing, tracing, isolation, and forceful macroeconomic measures, which have not paralyzed the economy. They have not shut down the whole economy as we've done here in Europe. So it's been a selective and a smart approach, and actually a model for the rest of the world on how to deal with such crises and how to deal with the unfortunately foreseeable second or third waves that are coming.
Now, with the pandemic looking to be a prolonged affair then, what are your prospects for the global economy in the long run? And what are your words of advice for Korea with regard to the country's efforts to keep its economy afloat?
Well, we think that what is lying ahead is not a V recovery. At best, it will look like a succession of Ws with a number of hiccups. And in fact, we spoke so far of our central scenario, our first scenario with a single hit, but we also have another scenario in our economic outlook with a deeper recession, both worldwide, 7.5% contraction this year, and a 2.5% contraction for Korea, which is actually close to the number the IMF put out very recently. Of course, the Korean government has taken a number of energetic measures to limit the extent of the contraction, in particular 3 supplementary budgets, with the latest one being the largest one on record. The central bank has acted, cutting rates to close to zero, and for the time being, all these measures are working their way through the economy. Korea has policy space to go further if the need arises later in the year, much more policy space, in fact, than most other countries, thanks to the consistently prudent policies that Korea has pursued in the past. But as your question as to how the Korean economy and others will look post-COVID, I think one of the lasting changes will be the extent of telework as one of the many forms of the contactless economy, since the crisis has revealed that many activities can be conducted quite efficiently in remote fashion, like my interview today.
All right, Dr. Kun, thank you very much for your thoughts and for making the time to join us live at this hour.
You're most welcome.
Right, Mr. Rooney, back here in the studio. Do you share Dr. Kun's thoughts about Korea's economic prospects for this year?
I think we can say a few things very straightforwardly. First, Korea responded really well to the virus itself. Around the world, much of the damage that's been done has not actually been by the virus, but by the human response to the virus, by shutting down, by closing things up, and so forth. We managed to navigate through that pretty well here. Secondly, Korea is connected very strongly with China's economy, and we sit right next to it. China took the first hit, but contained it, and then rebounded really fast. And Korea, I believe, is benefiting from China's rebound. This is not just about what we have done at home. And then thirdly, I think in Korea, we did not go into a sort of full-blown collapse. People carried on living. They wore masks. They managed social distancing. Maybe for a while, the restaurant sector was hurting. But in general, it wasn't ending life as we know it. It wasn't the kind of lockdowns that we've seen, draconian lockdowns, frankly, in England and in other countries. And it wasn't the laissez-faire, let's not care about it, that we've seen in the US. It was a path down the middle that actually, if you look at it, was just logical and prudent, and I think it's paid off well. But there's still serious things to be done. Of course, the airlines that was mentioned before, the tourism that was mentioned before. One of the bright spots from my point of view, though, is actually the auto sector. Not the auto sector in terms of combustion engines, But in terms of the electrical vehicle dimension, that sector actually has not stopped growing. That sector has been recovering. And if Hyundai and Kia can focus their energy on exporting more of those vehicles, they are being demanded elsewhere in the world. People are buying them. And it's a transition. So the world in many ways is in a big transition. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the rest here.
Right. Mr. Han, both Mr. Rooney and Dr. Koon have spoken favorably about Korea's proactive stance to both COVID-19 and perhaps even to its economy, which is why the government appears devoted to coming up with measures to stabilize the economy, and given its call for a third supplementary budget and, of course, the Korean version of the new Green Deal. From all these initiatives, which one strikes you the most?
The thing that strikes me the most is the third supplementary budget. It's the largest so far, it's $30 billion. And this shows the government's political will and desire to support companies and also the citizens. Now, what's interesting about this, the third measure, is that it emphasizes supporting sectors which is sort of outside traditional support systems, such as digital, like electric cars and green investments. So what's appealing to me is that the government simultaneously, while trying to find jobs for its citizens, is also developing new sectors. Hopefully that will lead to something much better than from the traditional sectors at this point. And what's also impressive is that the government's effort to create more jobs, around 1.5 million, I think that's as an admirable effort.
Would you metaphorically say the government is circling the wagon? Was it the last time you used the metaphor?
Yes, I will stick to that term. Thank you for remembering.
Right. Mr. Rooney, there has been debate here in the country for quite a while about the concept of universal basic income. This debate took place even before COVID-19, and now, in light of COVID-19, the debate has gotten fresh momentum. What are your thoughts on this policy of providing a set income to every citizen regularly without any strings attached?
So, in many ways, it's an extraordinary philosophical shift for us and for this world. Perhaps you could find parallels to it way back in history in communities where it was basically run for everybody's benefit. I don't have a political view on it, and I don't have a philosophical view on it. But I can see a practical view upon it, which is that any economy is based on income and spending. And if we take the spending part, that's what generates profits in the corporations, which is a key part. So any GDP that you want to measure is basically the sum of income or wages, as we'll call it, and profits of the companies. By providing this universal basic income to its citizens, a country basically, hopefully, can guarantee that they will be spending that money. It's not intended to be savings, it's intended to be consumption. And by having steady consumption, by stabilizing consumption in a country, you then stabilize the industrial sectors, the suppliers of that consumption, you help the restaurants and everybody else, plus you have a general well-being amongst your citizens. Korea has got an extraordinarily good healthcare system, which is run on a public insurance basis. We all contribute to it, but we all benefit from it. And perhaps this has a parallel there, which we're providing living conditions, if you like, through this UBI that will benefit people. But I have to say, one, the devil is in the details. It's how you implement it. And this is such a new concept that we haven't yet fully understood its ramifications. There are other countries doing it as well, and I like to think of these things very positively, but time will tell.
Right, time will tell, of course. Mr. Han, what is your outlook for the Korean economy for the rest of the year, and what measures do you believe will keep the economy on relatively stable ground in light of COVID-19?
Yes. So for the remainder of the year, I'm relatively positive. I think the stimulus from the various supplementary measures should help the economy. Low interest rates, low inflation rate have stabilized the real estate market, with some areas rising. And people have learned to cope with this virus too. So they're going out, they're going to restaurants, they're going out for entertainment. So the second half should be okay. But I think the biggest concern is after the virus ends, there's a lot of debt. And it'll be technically difficult to withdraw all that liquidity, and taxes will probably go up, inflation will be higher, and more worrisome will be Korea's low birth rate and aging population. And those are the issues that the government will have to tackle post-coronavirus.
So even after coronavirus, we still have some very grave issues to deal with.
Yes.
Mr. Rooney, what are your words of advice with regard to Korea for it to better weather, that is, the COVID-19 pandemic?
So I think I'll build on Bruce's point that we have created debt as a result of these government actions, debt that wouldn't have been there otherwise. And debt relief needs to happen across the economy. We can't crush the economy under a debt load that can never be serviced. But hopefully that's well within our capability. And the second thing, which I think is the most important, is to focus on jobs. 20 years ago, we had the 1 million jobs program. The government has launched the 1.5 million jobs program. I think we can go for a bigger number than that. We can go for 3 to 5 million jobs over the next 5 years, let's say, because jobs represent the future. And our youngsters coming out of college, and even our middle rank executives who find themselves retiring earlier than expected, everybody here needs to improve their skills and upgrade their capabilities and be in the workforce. If we're going to have universal basic income, let's have universal economic participation in terms of people working and contributing and enjoying. People like to work. People like to have a purpose. It's not purely driven, at least in my view in Korea, by needing that paycheck and having it be a certain size. There's a certain amount of life we have to live, but there's a certain amount that every Korean person that I've ever known loves to contribute. Let's find outlets for that, but also let's find ways to raise people's skill capabilities to the economy of the future and not the economy of the past.
Right, thank you very much for your optimistic words, Mr. Rooney. And Mr. Han, as always, thank you for being with us
Thank
today.
you very much.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for Thursday's edition. On Friday, we touch upon the growing presence of asymptomatic patients in the country. In the meantime, do reach out to us through our social media accounts or our homepage, Arirang.com. Do take care and see you tomorrow.